Here we go. Do you hear me now?
Yep. Yep, we do. Yep. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be able to participate today. And I'd like to thank Martin also for his excellent overview of basically the reality check of what is happening in Myanmar, and particularly also in Arakan. I have also looked at, the notion of alternatives for the Rohingya quite closely, and have come up with a number of points that I think would be of interest. The first one is, if you take this UN conference on the 30th of December, which Rohingya are we actually talking about in the run-up to the conference? When you follow the discussions on this conference closely, it seems that it is all about the Rohingya in Bangladesh. And certainly they really deserve our full attention, it's not that. But there is an excellent 2024 report by Doctors Without Borders. It's called Behind the Wire, which looks at the 2.8 million Rohingya around the world. And these should all be on the agenda of the UN conference. It's not too late, it can still be done. And I hope that that report, Behind the Wire, can be shared with you in the chat. Now, let's say it's now 3 million, because these figures are 1.5 years old. Let's say there are 3 million Rohingya around the world. 1.2 are in Bangladesh, and probably some 500,000 remain in Arakan. That leaves another 1.3 million in other countries, such as Malaysia, Indonesia, India, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. But in the preparations for New York, we hardly hear about these very large, significant groups. Of course, it's ironically also that some of these countries, like India, for example, has recently been forcing the Rohingya on its territory back into both Myanmar and into Bangladesh. Malaysia has also been pushing back Rohingyas who try to reach their shores with very rickety, unseaworthy boats. This is a UN conference, and there's still time. And I hope that the UN can take the lead in this to ensure that the conference covers all countries with a significant Rohingya population. My second point, the question of inclusion, the question of equality for all in Myanmar, including citizenship. The Burmese author, Sai Lat, calls this a major blind spot in the current anti-coup movement, and rightly so. If you take a look at the Federal Democracy Charter of 2021, which is basically a roadmap for transition to a new constitution, adopted by the Opposition National Unity Consultative Council, or NUCC, if you look at that, the original document does not accept the principle of non-discrimination, equality for all. It continues to categorize people in two groups: officially recognized groups, or Tangyen Ta, as they called in Myanmar, and others with differential rights. I was deeply disappointed when I saw this, because it didn't at all gel with the enthusiasm and determination by so many people in the Spring Revolution who are keen to achieve profound change. Now, it's urgent because a new draft is now being prepared also by the NUCC and will probably be adopted ahead of the junta's planned December elections. So this is a critical time to lobby for a change that reflects equality for all. And mind you, this is important, citizenship has often been seen as a problem for the Rohingya. it is not only a Rohingya issue. It also affects other communities, including other Muslims, Chinese, Hindus, Gurkhas, Sikhs, Anglo-Burmans, and so on. Let's start presenting it as an issue that affects a large number of people. And according to Sailat, who I mentioned earlier, it could be between 10 and 15% of Myanmar's population, including the Rohingya. So this is an immediate action point for everyone who is in touch with the members of the NUCC to make sure that the right decisions are taken and that in a new document, equality for all is the basic principle. My third point relates to what I call the fog of war. It is really difficult to characterize the current situation of the Rohingya in Arakan and in the refugee camps in Bangladesh. Just now, Martin called the situation fraught, and that I think is what I completely agree with. It is clear that suffering is immense and that atrocities are being committed, no doubt about it. But as in many other places around the world, violent conflict, displacement, and hunger shroud a clear view of developments on the ground. That's what is called the fog of war. And as often in such situations, deliberate disinformation thrives. Let's not pretend that we have a full view of what is happening in Arakan and in the camp. Lack of independent access and blocked internet connections even compound the situation. It pays to be very careful with news and information during the rounds, both in Arakan and in Bangladesh. Independent confirmation is needed, but often unavailable. It is a tragedy that the military regime in Naypyidaw has succeeded, and I should say once again, with its divide and rule policy. It may no longer have control over 90% of Arakan. The divide is its continuing success. It pits the Rohingya against the other communities in the state. And linked to the question of the fog of war is the question of victimhood. Obviously, it's not necessary to argue that the Rohingya are victims. It's accepted around the world. But what about the other communities in Arakan? The Rakhine, the Maramaji, the Kaman, the Hindus, the Chin, and others. They too are victims. They too have had their villages bombed and burned, their clinics, schools, and prayer houses destroyed, while thousands are displaced in areas where relief goods do not reach them. A first step in reconciliation should be acknowledgement that all of Arakan's people are victims. And clearly, I haste to say, there are different degrees of victimhood and destitution, and these too must be acknowledged. But first, we will need independent investigation into what happened in both Northern Arakan and in Bangladesh over the last 2 years. One part should deal with atrocity allegations against the Arakan army, Myanmar's military regime, and Rohingya militias. The other part should focus on what happened in Bangladesh. How did Rohingya militias in Bangladesh manage to get a firm grip on the Rohingya population in refugee camps? Where did funding for their arms and their operations come from? And how was it possible that hundreds, if not thousands, of fighters managed to cross the Bangladesh-Myanmar border unnoticed? These are critical questions that go to the heart of the problems that we are now facing. Last is, and it sort of combines the earlier 3 points I managed, the need for a comprehensive plan for Arakan. Arakan's problems are manifold, and while it is tempting to focus only on some of the worst manifestations, such as the Rohingya crisis, this would not bring about the badly needed comprehensive and sustainable solutions. One comprehensive plan for all of Arakan is needed, a plan that focuses not only on humanitarian needs, because that's where the focus is at the moment, but on dealing comprehensively with 3 major crises, which incidentally were also identified in the Annan report as the major issues. Sorry, I've lost my text here, but I can do it off the top of my head. Do you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that is a crisis of human rights, a crisis of security, and a crisis of economy and development. These are the three major issues that have to be worked out in a comprehensive plan, and it will take years for that to come about and to let alone be implemented. But it is important for the international community to look at how it can assist with the development of such a comprehensive plan. A comprehensive plan that will require of them that they forget about the very state-centric approach that they have been using. Looking at the regime in Naypyidaw as the provider of solutions for the issues that they feel serious about. That has to change. You have to be more practical. You have to be more pragmatic. And a case that is important is the immediate need in a very pragmatic way of starting up the supply of relief goods, urgent relief goods from Bangladesh into Myanmar. I know this is a difficult question for Bangladesh. I acknowledge that. But pragmatism, I think, and the need of not only the Rohingyas themselves and the other people that live in Northern Arakan, but it's also in the interest of Bangladesh's own requirements in terms of security and stability that pragmatic ways be found to open a regular supply of relief goods into Arakan and Myanmar. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Letitia. We have only about 5 minutes left for this session. I can take any questions or quick points from the floor here, and online they can be put into the chat box. No, not yet. Okay. Anyone from the room who wishes to? Yes, please. Oh, right.
Oh, was it? Sorry. Yeah. Thank you so much. This is Vicky Tennant. I'm from UNHCR. I actually served in Myanmar a few years ago, and I've spent time in Bangladesh, and really just want to endorse much of what has been said, but also to just add a few comments specifically around the ongoing displacement that we're seeing both within Rakhine and from Rakhine, and clearly we're still seeing people forced across the border into Bangladesh, around 150,000 since early last year, and that has been a complicated situation, I think, as we all know. Just to flag also the use of mines, heavy use of mines inside Rakhine, and that's of course affecting prospects for return, including internally displaced people. There's been some out-of-community who have been injured this year as a result of mines, and of course that links to the wider issue of humanitarian access. Very, very challenging. UNHCR has had a presence both in Sittwe and in Mongdo for many years, but we had to relocate the team from Mongdo to Sittwe last year, and we haven't been able to resume the activities in northern Rakhine since then. And also, continuing obviously to work, with partners to try to expand humanitarian assistance, humanitarian access. But I think what's very, very clear, and what we've heard from the first two speakers, is that humanitarian assistance is not going to create the conditions for return, and that call for dialogue with all the stakeholders, including those who have the possibility of influence on the various stakeholders, is really well heard, and I think very much resonates from the UNHCR perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your analysis, both of you. Do you think there's any opportunity, which I think is ultimately the only way forward, to ever implement either the original or an amended version of the inclusive constitution, which was never put in place? When I visited that area, I found complete hostility amongst ordinary people to any of the minority groups whatsoever. And I've heard all the reports I've read since then have shown the same, that any desire for anybody to bring those groups into the state again. Thank you.
Martin, Letitia, were you able to hear that question? It relates to something that, Letitia, you already referred to, the sort of the failure even in the NUCC to recognise equality of peoples. Any prospects of that changing?
So I didn't hear. It must be a very bad connection here in The Hague. I'll take blame for the bad connection in The Hague, but all I heard at one point was UNHCR. Stands out.
Yeah. Okay, Martin, did you want to?
Yes, I think the conflict trap. This has been going on. If you go back to 1947 and go through to the modern day, how many times have all the stakeholders in conflict even been in the same room? I think I could only point to one date that was a majority in August 2016 when the NLD organised a 21st Century Panglong Conference. It was absolutely a moment when you saw everybody there and a potential, if only people could talk to each other, there could be change. When you move away from that, you will find all sorts of groups drawing up bits of paper, constitutions, and then you ask them a question, they say, well, here's our constitution, haven't you read it? Well, what does that matter if there's no dialogue? If there's actually no process which can bring people together. So it's fine that people go ahead with ideas. And I think linking what I said and Letitia said, I think we've already got an important idea of the sort of thing which needs to be concentrated on. That's the citizenship laws. It doesn't matter who the government is. The whole country, all the peoples have to face up to having citizenship laws which are open to all. So that's what I would do. I would say, well, it's not one statement or another. You don't go into negotiations and say, well, this is our position, accept it. We've got to actually help that debate. And I do believe that there's much better potential now than there has been before, because the younger generations, you meet young Rohingya people, they're much more open to saying, yes, we need to talk about this. There wasn't a situation 10, 20, 30 years ago where that was even a feasible proposition. And when you have a meeting like this on the UN, yes, these were the moment to bring all these things out. So yes, I think we shouldn't sort of say, well, one group's got the answers and the other doesn't. This is a discussion and everybody has to take part in that. There's a lot of misunderstanding sometimes, like the word federal, just to give you one example. That was forbidden from 1962. That's why the military coup happened in 62. And then in 2011, the generals turned around and said federalism's okay. So what had gone on? They just changed their view on the word federalism. We've really got to nail this down much more clearly in political terms.
Well, thanks, Martin. Let's end the session on a somewhat positive note, even though it's faced us with the enormity of the problem that this discussion is facing. But thank you very much to you. Thank you, Letitia, very much to you also. And we're on schedule for me to hand the chair over, I think, to Mark Bowden. We'd like to.
Is this on? On?
We have both on, we get feedback.
Is this on?
Yes. Right. Well, good afternoon. My name is Mark Bowden. I should introduce myself as someone who has worked with the Rohingya refugees the first time in 1979 in Bangladesh, which is where I first met Dr. Sultana Khanum. And then again, I went in 2019 to review the influx again. We're very lucky in this session, which we're going to explore the current status and conditions of refugees and local communities in Bangladesh and what can be done to achieve them, to have two people who know a great deal about the situation. Dr. Sultana Khanum is an eminent Bangladeshi pediatrician who latterly worked for WHO, but has spent a lot of time post-retirement engaged with the Rohingya communities in Bangladesh, looking at both their health status and then advising various international organizations on improvements that can be made in the situation there. We're also very lucky to be joined by Lucky Karim, who's joining us from New York. Lucky's lived in Cox's Bazar for 6 years before she was resettled to the US in December 22. She's a founder of Refugee Women for Peace and Justice and has worked for many international organizations, but is also working with Refugee International on the advocacy side. I understand that Dr. Sultana will start the discussion with the current status, the camp focusing a lot on the health issues and particularly the issues facing children in the camp, and then we'll ask Lucky to look at the issues relating to women and the general issues of advocacy. So, Dr. Sultana, over to you.
Thank you very much, the organizers, for giving me the opportunity to reflect some of the Rohingya issues. As Mark said, that I'm a pediatrician and I'm a child rights activist as well. And my talk will be focusing on children. And I just, we heard from the two eminent speakers what's the situation there, and I'm not going to go into say anything about that. But I could just begin by saying that the Rohingyas as people were never free, never in their own countries, neither in the countries that they have fled to. And they are confined to Rakhine, as you know, and which is considered to be a prison state, Rakhine, a prison state, where they have no freedom of movement and no freedom of many basic services that human rights can really want or can really expect. That because they are restricted freedom of movement, there is no livelihood, no economic activities, and there is always poverty in them. But as we know that in August 2017, there was the influx of about 1 million people from Rakhine, and as a result of the brutalities of the Myanmar army. And out of this, about 1 million people, 50% or around 50% were children. As I said, I'm going to talk about the plight of these children. When they came into the countries, none of the children were immunized. A lot of them were severely malnourished. Some are severe and different grades of malnutrition, and with different diseases, a lot of them, and very few are in normal status. I trust we all know that what happens if there is undernutrition or if there is malnutrition, that affects health, growth, immunity to be able to fight infection, and cognitive function. And all these will happen to these children, and if they are not properly nourished. And the earliest nutrition survey that they did was in October 2017. And it was found that wasting, that the current acute nutrition, acute deprivation was about 20%. And short for age or stunting was about 44%. And anemia was about 48% on October 2020, so after 2 months of coming to this place. And those were much higher figure. And the concern, public health concern, serious public health concern. And they were much higher than the host country or Myanmar country, national country itself. And timely, adequate intervention was done by the international community. We all know who are working there. And situation over the years improved. And the yearly assessment, yearly nutrition survey showed that in 2019, situation improved. The wasting from 20% went down to about 11% over the years in 2020. Stunting from 44% went down to about 35%, and anemia was 48 to 38%. It means that the timely intervention, which is available, if fund is available, if commitment is there, passion is there, if we want to do something, things can be improved. But what happened? Why this improvement could not be sustained? But the figures in 2023 and 24, things have gone up again. That means the wasting has gone up from 11% to 15%. Stunting has gone up from 38% to 41%, and it may remain the same. Because of this, the reduction of the fund by international communities, by USAID, which affected the whole world, but it affected most in the refugee camps. And what happened? Due to the lack of fund, there were, of course, negative coping strategy. And this negative coping strategy, first of all, the challenges is hit the food supply, healthcare, food supply. And as it is the food supply and healthcare, the negative strategy included, it's impacted on the frequency of meals was reduced, the nutritious and diversified food was reduced, and pregnant women sacrificed their meals to feed the children, pregnant women who needed most. So these are the negative strategies they had to undertake to feed the children. And also the closure of most of the health cares because of the fund, as well as the closure of the learning centers where children were going for some kind of education. And those learning centers were taught from the Burmese curriculum, not the local curriculum. And that's how the coping strategy is also over there, that it affected all areas of the child development and all areas of child nutrition status, child health status, women's nutrition status. And my question is, although all those efforts, all those interventions worked, why couldn't this intervention be sustained? Why, if it was sustained, the improvement would be sustained. It means the implementation intention is there, the people are there, everything is there, but what is not there is the proper funding, and which is not coming for them, for the refugees. So I feel that we have to have a strategy for the children, which will work, which will improve their conditions, as well as it will be sustained so that there is no drip, like from 11% going up to 20% is a huge concern, and it's a huge public health problem. Whereas in the host countries and other countries, they are maintaining the international standard. And why couldn't the camps keep international standard? I have happened to visit Malaysia and some of the refugee camps. The situation, the country dynamic is different, but situation for children and women is not any better. So what really my point, the message I want to make very, very strongly, that wherever these children are, the children's need cannot wait. And this need cannot wait for repatriation. We do not know when the repatriation is going to happen. Does that mean that children should stop growing? That children should stop not eating? That children should stop the uneducated and be substandard human beings? And those children, when they came to the country, to Bangladesh, the 4-year-old, 5-year-old are now teenagers. They are now 13, 14 years old. And what have they done not to being able to go to school? Where is their dignity? And they have certain barriers that they cannot go to school. Probably Lucky will be able to highlight some of the security problem that these young girls face to be able to go to accessible health services or accessible learning centers because of the security and because of the safety. And again, I would strongly feel that we must make children a better arrangement for children, that wherever they are, for how many days, how many years, how many months they are going to be there, their services must be funded by the international community because their need cannot wait until repatriation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sultana. And Lucky, if I can hand over to you now virtually. And as Sultana has highlighted, it'd be very helpful to get some view as well, not just of women, but the whole issue of integration with communities. So if I could hand over to you now.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning from Washington, D.C. Sorry, it's been a little bit crazy for me. I'm just on my way to next trip. But I'll try to really focus on the current conditions and situations in the camps and a little bit on the Rakhine State side in Myanmar as well. And thanks for the organizers to organizing this timely event. First of all, I was in Bangladesh last week for the stakeholder dialogue that the government hosted in Cox's Bazar. And I spoke at one of the sections, which is thematic section 1, focused on humanitarian crises in Bangladesh and in Myanmar, alongside other UN agencies locally operating in the country. And it was also good to connect with some civil society members in the camps during the conference, and some local organizations, of course, and community members in general, especially the new arrivals from Myanmar. And in earlier this year in March as well, just 4 months ago, I became the first resettled Rohingya to return back to Cox's Bazar for the first time after just 2 years of my arrival in the US. So this was my second trip to Bangladesh soon after I came back. From my both walking and lived experience in the camps as refugee myself, and my recent 2 trips to Bangladesh after I became part of diaspora, I think we need to think beyond the refugee life and humanitarian aids. And especially, we shouldn't forget the remaining members of the Rohingya community who are still in Rakhine State, Myanmar. We often talk about the refugees who are in Cox's Bazar, but really forget about the other community members who are in our neighboring countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and even IDPs, the internally displaced people in Rakhine State, and the remaining members of the community who are still in villages. in different cities in the state. So just to kind of talk through the challenges. First of all, when we were in Bangladesh in March, WFP, the World Food Program, was expecting the announcement of food ration cuts for individual to cut down from $12 to $6, which is more than half. And if that happened, it would be almost end of the conversation, is end of the story. Because if people are starving in the camps, have no meals to survive, while they also have very limited resource to job opportunities, livelihood, almost 0.00% livelihood opportunities in the camp. And they are only dependent on the humanitarian aids, and especially the food rations coming from World Food Program every month, once in a month for them. And so if that went down to more than half for one individual per month, and I think it would be almost on top of everything that we have in the list. So thankfully, US said they will continue until the end of the year, which they're now doing, but that doesn't mean their funding improves the condition or situations in the camp. It's only keeping the same amount of food that people used to receive from WFP every month. And that doesn't guarantee the future funding for Rohingya, especially starting from January 2026. So yeah, I think there is a little bit of a news that US is not really expecting any funding at this point for Rohingya, especially starting from next year and 2026. And that's very concerning for us, since the numbers of refugees are growing in the camps almost every day. So far, if I'm not wrong, I think we have 30 newborns every month in the camps. And we do receive oftentimes families and individuals trying to cross border from Myanmar to rejoin their existing families in Cox's Bazar. Oftentimes these cases are not public, not on media, but definitely government of Bangladesh receives a lot of individuals and families from Myanmar almost every day and every week. And then going back to the regional, local level challenges, again, as I did mention a little bit, the livelihood is still a big challenge when it comes to refugee life in Cox's Bazar. People don't tend to talk about it oftentimes, and being ignored by the local government to try to find ways for livelihood opportunities for families in the camps, especially those with zero earnings and people with disabilities. Women-headed family, for example, who are only dependent on the ration foods from WFP. The educations, again, there are some improvement on the education part, but recently we've seen the UNHCR had to shut down all their learning centers in the camps. So those learning centers are usually referred to be called the child-friendly spaces, not the schools. So which means it's only for the kids, not for the adult age of my group, younger than myself or a little bit older than myself. So this adult age group have almost nothing to do in the camps. They don't have schools to go to, they don't have jobs to be busy with. And what they do is usually oftentimes being engaged in illegal activities, such as forced recruitment by the armed actors in the camps, different other illegal business, which is hard to avoid and hard to prevent. You can't imagine in a tiny shelter when a killed is waiting whole day, whole night, not really doing anything. So anything comes to them, they will just take advantage of it. And then on the security side, for the last couple of months, there has been some improvement on the security side, especially after there was an agreement between all the armed group in the camps. They call it a Four Brother Alliance in the camps. So after that happened, for the last couple of months, the security risks have been increased slightly. So there is no public gun shooting, public killings or murders anymore, at least for the last few months. But again, it's a big question mark of how long it will last and how sustainable it is. On the repatriation, again, it is a very huge challenge for us to talk about refugees possibly returning back to Myanmar. And to me, as someone who is coming from the ground, I think it doesn't make sense to me at all, because Bangladesh definitely is not my country. So to my knowledge, repatriation shouldn't start from Bangladesh. It should begin within Myanmar, within the Rakhine state. Before we talk about refugees, nearly 1.3 million people from Cox's Bazar to return back to Myanmar, we should talk about the IDPs, the internally displaced people inside Rakhine state. How about them? Are they able to return back to their homes safely before we go back from Bangladesh? And the humanitarian crisis inside Rakhine state. The organizations, UN agencies, donors, local civil society organizations should be able to operate and freely without any restriction to be able to deliver humanitarian aid for the remaining members of the community, Rohingya and other minorities in Rakhine State. That's very important. So these are the very first two baby steps the authority of Myanmar can take to finding way for sustainable repatriation or sustainable solution for the community, and then talk about the justice and accountability for those refugees in Cox's Bazar for their return. So that's how I think it should look like whenever the repatriation is happening. And expectations on the high-level conference, which is coming up very soon, later this month in New York. I am one of the 4 speakers from the Rohingya community for the high-level conference as well on the 30th. I think from my understanding, since I've been engaged in the process of preparation from the very beginning, is, again, just to understand, it's not a political dialogue. It's not a political conference hosted by any government. It is a UN conference. So from where you cannot expect a political sustainable solution for this community for us to be able to go back to Myanmar. And suddenly there wouldn't be any Myanmar authority in the room. So it will be discussions between us with the member states, UN agency folks, civil society, community, and donors without having the Myanmar authority in the room again, who have committed the genocide. So definitely we don't expect any political solution to come out of this. I think few expectations out of this conference would be to secure funding for Rohingya, to have donors to be committed moving forward. For how long we will need to remain in Cox's Bazar, since the repatriation does not have a deadline for us. We don't know when it's going to happen. It might take decades long. It might happen tomorrow, next month. But refugees need to have sufficient food and funding for them to be able to survive in the camps. And the other expectation is to grab the attentions of the international community back to our crisis and our people. For the last 2.5 years almost, the attention of the policymakers, international community, donors have really gone away from us and back to the other recent crises that happened in the world, including Gaza, Ukraine, and other issues that happened after 2017, after we became refugee in Bangladesh. So I think it is becoming really a challenge for us to get people pay attention to us. So that's one of this is the other second expectation out of this conference. And for us, for continue discussions, for continued collaborations and coordinations between the ASEANs and the member states and the donors itself, and with the Rohingya directly. So these are the few, very little expectations I personally see out of this conference, but nothing really big or immediate to happen afterwards. When it comes to civil society representation, both at the humanitarian level or political level, is still a huge challenge for us. This is something to really work on, and it will take time. Wouldn't happen anytime soon, I guess. And we're not unique for that. Every community, we're a very diverse community as Rohingya with so many different generations, but we're not unique for that. Almost every country, every community that are displaced have those kind of similarities that we do. So I think it will take time for us to have a political platform, political committee or representative that will be more inclusive and diverse for us to be able to work politically and engage at the political level, but also equally important for us to have civil society engagements. And to conclude here, I guess I wouldn't take much time. For us as a community, and for those of you who are listening in the rooms, we should remember that Rohingya needs 2 solutions, a medium-term and a long-term solutions. As I said, we are not going back tomorrow. We're not going back home tonight, and we never know when it's going to happen. So I think we need to say, and sadly, we have more Rohingya outside Myanmar and less in our own country. So it's very important for us to have medium-term solutions. That includes livelihood, educations for kids, and of course, protection and funding for refugees while they're still in the camps. And then the long-term solution is definitely a sustainable, voluntarily dignified repatriation back to our country, which will take a lot of efforts and advocacy and work for us to continue moving forward before we have that. So these are the 2 solutions that are needed, and for both of which we are required to have day-to-day engagement with the international community, UN agencies and stakeholders and the policymakers, and especially the government as well for the long-term one. So I want to call on the international community. I think it is not too late to come back to the track, I guess, for us. And it's very important. The only small, tiny window we have to explore is the international friends, for us to be able to work with them together to find those solutions and to be able to be in a position where we don't have to be back and forth. And again, going back to the repatriation point, to me, as someone who I'm from the later generations, but I did study a lot on the past lesson learned that we have had. So my grandma was refugee, who's still alive in Bangladesh twice when she herself was killed. And every time she was refugee, she was sent back to Myanmar, and I was born in 2003. And when I was only 14, together we again fled home. So it's just one of the many examples. We've just been back and forth from Myanmar. Oftentimes, we return back to Myanmar after decades long. We again became refugee in Bangladesh. So this time, I don't want to see that kind of thing happen, and I want to see it's more permanent and sustainable, so we don't have to be back and forth again to Bangladesh. And 2017 is not the first time the genocide been committed against us, and 2017 is not the first time we became refugee in Bangladesh. We still have some refugees from the 90s or even earlier who are called the registered refugee in Kutupalong camp, who was separated from our largest population that arrived in 2017. So repatriation is all about who is responsible after our return to Myanmar for the human rights violation that we will go through. It's not about who is sending us or who is facilitating the repatriation. Thank you. Let's stop there.
Thanks. Thank you, Lucky. That was very helpful. And we have, well, we're possibly at coffee break. I'm going to ask your indulgence and to allow for a few minutes to cut into a generous coffee break to just take a couple of questions. But there are a couple of points that I'd like to perhaps just elaborate on. Sultana, I mean, you're highlighting the fact that there will be a continued deterioration of the situation,
Yeah.
possible crisis. So I wonder if you could say anything about Basan Char, or where the hotspots and the crisis are likely to be in the next year, and what sort of immediate action might take place. I see we also have two hands over there. So let's take those questions as well, if they're related. So, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much for such a interactive session. I'm Captain Kibria, founder of MS Global Group and Dr. Musroja Foundation, working on action-based rather than documentary and the papers confined to the documents, everything. So anyway, I'm from Bangladesh. The ideology regarding this prospect of the present situation of this Rohingya people, their condition is actually deteriorated every day in a traumatic situations we have been observing. What is my proposal is that we have to have an approach of sustainable productive engagement. This sustainable productive engagement, what I mean is that we just simply cannot depend on like foreign aid. We should engage them like intensive based labor, small manufacturing items we can put them, because if we can make all the problems, mental health, everything is happening because they don't get food, proper food. You know, problem is happening, right? Root cause is there. If we engage them with labor-based intensive, it will reduce risk of radicalization. If they remain idle and they're diverting to the reprint course, that's what we have been observing, you know, doing nothing. Number two is that mental health will be increased. Number three, the dependency of the foreign aid also will be not much required. Number four, the country will be benefit. So I think it is better we should work. We don't know that repatriation will be happening when, but we can work on the sustainable engagement so that they can at least survive. They can have their food. Then the malnutrition and the health issues will be automatically solved. They're not getting food. So I think we should put on these bills to the United Nations and see that we can do it. And I am from the foundation. I am ready to assist in this in any way possible, by economy, by money, or putting the supporting for a manufacturing factory there as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very interesting panel, and thank you both, all three of you, The statistics which came from Sultana are shocking. Stunting 44, 38%, depending on which year, anemia 45%, I think. And from Lucky, we hear that the aid per month for food will go down potentially to 6%, and everyone is saying that it's going to get worse. At what stage is it going to be meaningful and scientifically provable to talk about starvation and famine, both in the camps in Bangladesh and inside Rakhine State, where there are already unconfirmed reports of starvation and famine? I ask the question because I also work on Gaza, and a few weeks ago, when the UN declared effectively that famine had taken hold amongst about 500,000 people in northern Gaza, it was an advocacy moment where the world seemed to wake up and the narrative shifted. How far are we away from that moment of being able to declare or being forced to declare famine and starvation in relation to both the camps in Bangladesh and also the community inside Rakhine State? Thank you.
We're going over time, but
yes, I'm sorry. Should you maybe you could unmute yourself? Or maybe in the meantime. Okay. Who was it? Sorry. Hello. I'd like to ask why the United Nations have not brought sanctions against certain particular countries that are contributing to this refugee crisis, because Iran has been sanctioned several times for the last decades, and is inadmissible that you have countries in Asia, Africa, or wherever, creating terrorism, terrorizing people, and subjecting communities to structural poverty. I don't know how Myanmar's situation will improve in decades, because after colonization we had poverty and displacement, and it just perpetuates unless there's sanctions, international sanctions, and the money is redirected to the communities, to the Rohingya communities. There will not be a viable solution. So is there a possibility of financing the communities, Rohingya communities, with money from India, Myanmar, and whoever is trading with the military that's creating all these refugees? Thank you.
Talk about the crisis, and Lucky, if you could take that last question, if you heard it properly, on the possibility of sanctions. If I could also add, Lucky, if you could just perhaps say something a bit about the challenges to integration with the community, and whether there's any option for improving employment capacities and capabilities in Bangladesh. So, Sultana, over to you.
What did the speaker ask about the stunting issue?
The issue about stunting was when, I think the question is whether there will be famine, or when will it be possible to say there is famine? What status are we in terms of IPC 4 or 5? And
what is IPC?
International Phase Classification. Sorry, but essentially, when perhaps you could outline what you see happening in terms of the deterioration of the situation, and what the critical areas will be.
Well, first, the gentleman from Bangladesh, what he said, I don't think he needs any, I need to answer any of those. I agree, because, you know, the creating dependency totally on the donors and the thing is really an issue. But there are restrictions because these people are not allowed to movement. So livelihood for them It's not them that they don't want to work, but it's the restriction that they can't move. They can't do whatever they want to. So there is already their problem that the labor they use from the refugee camps people. And also you're right, there has to be some kind of income generation activities inside within the women's group or the adolescents group, which should be initiated so that they can generate income within them for the families. Yeah, yes, that's the point taken. That's many people are asking that issue. Yeah, thank you. And about your Bhasanchar issue is Bhasanchar, their last government has started it, and which I personally feel is inhuman, because in 2020 they started, it was a political stunt. They wanted to achieve something, and Bhasanchar is an island, it's a river island. It's just in the mouth of the Bay of Bengal, that any big cyclones come anytime, the whole island will be washed out. And that means all refugees will be on the sea, washed out. But that was a very insensible decision taken. The current government now has stopped that. And because they have already made their health services are not much there, they have to come to the mainland for everything. And on the way, there is boat capsized and they die, or they escape and go to the other countries. So the current government has stopped that, and they have given them the choice that if they wanted to come back to the mainland, they can come back. So that Chor issue is closed, and they are now trying how those people voluntarily they can come back to the mainland. And whoever stays there, there will be supplies for those people. But ultimately, Bhasanchar will, I feel, and the government also feel, that will not work. The current government. But future government after election, when they come, what they will do, we don't know. But this is the situation. And about the issue of famine, the current situation, now that World Food Program has said that they are not, after November 2025, they are going to stop the food that they're giving. And the most will be suffered the children who start stunting at the age of 2. From 6 months up to 2 years of age, if we cannot give the nutritious and diversified food, they will be stunting. And if this situation now, if we don't take care of it, then the stunting will improve, wasting will improve, and there is going to be hunger and more malnutrition in the camps. We can say that. And so in order to stop that, the local community, international community has to come up, and the WFP, if they stop, and then $7 million has to be obtained per month to keep these people survived. See, and where are we going to get that? That is the question, big question now. Thank you.
Thank you. Lucky, would you like to come in on the issue of the integration of the community and also the question of sanctions? Hello? Hello, Lucky, can you hear us? Have we got communications with Lucky or? Otherwise.
Sophia was also got his hand up. He was asking to raise a question. One of our panelists for the session after the break. You could invite him just to unmute himself. He should be able to do that himself.
Okay. So would you like to unmute yourself, Shubin?
Hi, thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just had a quick comment on the contribution by Captain Kibria, if I'm not mistaken. Apologies if I've got the name wrong. He's absolutely right. And I think what his comment does is to show that this is not just a funding problem. Funding cuts are a critical factor, certainly, but the crisis of Rohingya malnutrition and stunting and so on is structural, and it's rooted in policy choices, as Dr. Khanam has pointed out, restrictions and the deliberate design of containment. So funding matters, but it's not the whole story by any means. The camps were never designed for long-term well-being, just to warehouse people basically. So the politics of exclusion means there's no plan for durable nutrition, livelihoods, social services, etc. But what we should really be pointing out that even in the worst crisis, which are these funding cuts, the government resists reforms that would allow refugees to feed themselves. Yeah, that's all I had to say.
Okay, thanks. I think at this stage we need to close this session, which I think has highlighted both the immediacy of a potential crisis at the end of the year and next year, but also the real challenges that exist in terms of a sustainable response to the refugee situation. I think Lucky also pointed out the importance of perhaps dealing with the issues of the internally displaced as a priority before addressing the long-term issues of repatriation. And with that, let me invite you all to have a quick break, shorter break now than we planned, for tea and coffee. And just to tell the online participants, we'll be back in 15 minutes. Well done.
Mhm. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, for this session. My name is Ewan MacLeod. The title is slightly misleading. As an independent consultant, I worked for the European Commission, for the United Nations, and for the World Bank for 40 years on these challenging displacement and political crises. So our session is focused on what is termed alternative and medium-term approaches. As the preceding discussion has evidenced, we also need to think very, very long-term about these challenges. Just to frame the context for these forthcoming reflections, I think there are three things that we need to bear in mind. One, there is a global funding crisis for humanitarian and development aid. And this is very real in the context of Bangladesh and Rohingya. The UN appeal, the last time I looked, was only 36% funded. Now, that's hundreds of millions of dollars less. And the behind the dry statistic means exactly the kind of issues that have been broached by our previous speakers. Lost opportunities in health, in education, in welfare, in livelihoods, you name it. As I say, Bangladesh is not alone being affected, but this is a. Secondly, the pathway through to peace and stability in Myanmar in general and Rakhine in particular is very problematic. It doesn't lend itself to easy answers nor easy responses, as we've heard. A third point, the policy context that's framing the situation in Bangladesh is also very challenging. And we need all of us to reflect further on whether there are things that can be done to improve the situation. This is a collective responsibility. The government of Bangladesh, the UN, international NGOs, and local society organizations all have a role to play in thinking how we can more cost effectively and particularly sustainably address the challenges that are in front of us. To help us think this through during this session, we have two excellent speakers, Mr. Shafir Rahman, who is a journalist and documentary maker, who will speak first, followed by Dr. Sanjeev Hossain, who is an expert in international humanitarian and refugee law and criminal law and a distinguished writer. So first off, let me pass to Shafir.
Thank you very much. I hope I don't lose you because I lost you a few seconds there, but please let me know because my connection has been a little bit flaky throughout the day, throughout the weeks, in fact. I think the humanitarian discussion around Rohingya refugees often portrays Bangladesh as a generous host, burdened by circumstances beyond its control. But this narrative misses the real story. Bangladesh has built a political economy of containment around the Rohingya refugee population. Its posture as a reluctant host masks a calculated strategy. Successive governments have adapted to the Rohingya presence through policies that convert exclusion into domestic political capital and international leverage. Control and restriction are not unfortunate byproducts of crisis management. They are deliberate, embedded in policy, and materially rewarding for political and economic elites. We've seen the same pattern again and again, from forced returns in 1978 and the 1990s, to the refusal to register Rohingya after 1992, to the post-27 regime of restrictions. Temporary shelter is offered, but long-term marginalization is the rule. The camps have been deliberately kept isolated and securitized. Barbed wire fencing, the bans on formal education, livelihoods, and movement, and the tolerance of armed groups and abusive policing all serve a dual purpose: to avoid integration and to maintain a constant crisis atmosphere that is useful for bargaining. So the real question from my point of view is, how do we make it more costly for Bangladesh to maintain the current system of Rohingya exclusion? Bangladesh extracts 4 key benefits from its restrictive approach. Firstly, political dividends. Bangladesh portrays itself internationally as a humanitarian host. By doing so, it secures global legitimacy and donor goodwill, even as it enforces draconian policies against the Rohingya. Secondly, economic gains. Bangladesh secures aid flows, infrastructure development, and contracts for local elites. Thirdly, labor exploitation. Bangladesh benefits from undocumented Rohingya workers in various industries. I will elaborate on this shortly. Geostrategic leverage, using the refugee population as a bargaining chip in relations with China, India, ASEAN, and the West. Whenever you read about the Rohingya, you will read that they're aid dependent. But let's just deconstruct that. The idea that Rohingya are merely passive recipients of aid erases their economic contributions, and more crucially, their systematic exploitation in Bangladesh's informal labor markets. Far from being idle, many Rohingya work. I read one figure which said over 50%, without rights, protections, or fair pay in agriculture, construction, salt farming, and garment production. These roles remain unrecognized precisely because formal recognition would require labor protections and disrupt a supply of cheap, exploitable labor. The aid-dependent label functions ideologically. It naturalizes containment, justifies exclusionary policies, and conceals the surplus value extracted from Rohingya lives. It also serves the interests of both Bangladeshi elites and international agencies. One gains control and patronage, the other maintains funding pipelines and institutional relevance. In truth, the Rohingya are made vulnerable not because they're a burden, but so they can be exploited, both as cheap labor and as commodities within the aid economy. When aid is cut and work is criminalized, refugees are pushed into unregulated, exploitative labor markets just to survive. The system traps them between dependence and danger. So if you like, punished if they rely on aid, and punished if they try to be self-reliant. This is why framing the challenge as one of mitigating impact through infrastructure or investment is so misleading. The issue is not the presence of refugees, but the architecture of exclusion that keeps them from contributing safely and legally. The greatest constraint on economic potential in Cox's Bazar is not the refugees themselves, but Bangladesh's deliberate policy of containment. Restrictions on movement, work, education have disabled meaningful participation. And at the same time, it fuels dependency and resentment. Infrastructure without rights becomes another tool of control. A serious strategy must begin by enabling safe, lawful livelihoods, as we have already discussed in the previous session, not as a political reward, but as a practical necessity in a protracted crisis. Denying Rohingya the ability to work legally compounds both humanitarian dependency and local economic dysfunction. It prevents them from living with dignity and denies host communities the potential gains of shared growth. I think this is the point that Captain Kibriya was making. Forward-looking investment must integrate both refugee and host communities through area-based development. And I'm talking about co-owned enterprises, skilled training centers, joint access to services, energy, water, etc. Development finance must be made conditional on rights-based reforms, not used to entrench a regime of exclusion. Any serious economic strategy must begin by restoring that agency. This architecture of control is enforced top-down through the camp in charge system. It's a command structure run by government officials with absolutely no democratic accountability to refugees. Camp in charges, or CICs, sit at the top of an exploitative hierarchy, overseeing everything from aid distribution to information flows. They act as gatekeepers for UN agencies, NGOs, and refugees alike, wielding authority through favoritism and coercion. The CIC system does not increase protection or participation. It entrenches dependency, sidelines Rohingya voices from decisions that shape their lives. It's not a humanitarian mechanism, it is an authoritarian one. Local hostility to the ideas proposed by United Against Inhumanity is almost inevitable unless the structural drivers of resentment are confronted. Because for years, state narratives and media framing have cast the Rohingya as job stealers, resource burdens, criminals, and security threats. A portrayal weaponized by political elites to justify harsh restrictions while ignoring the role of state policy in manufacturing that very tension. Any serious alternative must go beyond service delivery and confront this manufactured hostility head on. So to elicit support both from local people and authorities, the strategy must center on shared prosperity, not parallel systems. That means area-based development that visibly benefits both groups. Joint access to schools, health clinics, water, transport infrastructure. There needs to be transparent governance of aid funds, job creation schemes that favor Bangladeshi Rohingya collaboration rather than competition. And as I've said, narrative reframing, supported by independent media and civil society to dispel the image of the Rohingya as burdens that exists. So what does it really mean to go beyond the title of this workshop, which is, repatriation, beyond the tired script of repatriation and relief? It means breaking with the architecture of containment, a system that international agencies have too often stabilized through funding models, risk aversion, and bureaucratic inertia. Donor models remain timid, short-term, optics-driven, and allergic to political confrontation. By avoiding issues like movement, legal identity, or work rights, they end up reinforcing the very architecture of containment they claim to alleviate. Institutions like the World Bank, UNDP, UNHCR, IOM must fundamentally reorientate their engagement. That means no more funding without rights. Development finance must be tied to concrete gains, freedom of movement, access to work, education, all the issues I've mentioned above. No more secret MOUs by UNHCR or indeed any other organization. No more parallel systems. Investments must link refugee well-being to host community prosperity, not through charity, but through inclusive planning and shared governance of services and livelihoods. And no more empty theater. Stop staging high-profile visits while the real economy is built on refugee exploitation. To conclude, Bangladesh's model of Rohingya containment is not a temporary holding pattern. It is a politically and economically rewarding for the state. International actors must stop sustaining it. That means recalibrating the cost-benefit equation, confronting the aid industrial complex, dismantling the fiction of dependency, and building pathways to refugee agency through giving them rights and including them in economic policies. Anything less will simply reproduce the very exclusions we claim to oppose. Thank you very much.
Bishop Hewitt, for those stimulating observations. I pass to Sanjeev. Thank you. The floor.
I'm very grateful to be invited here today by UNA UK and United Against Humanity. Thank you very, very much for having me. I've been studying the Rohingya refugee situation for about 5 years now, since 2020. I've spoken to countless Rohingya refugees living in camps in Bangladesh. I've conducted research with Rohingya refugees living in camps. I've written with them. I've traveled to Bhasanchar twice, and those trips allowed me to gain a deeper sense of the situation there and the nature of challenges faced by refugees relocated to the island. So what I'm about to say today is based on this constant engagement with the Rohingya refugee situation in Bangladesh. I'm going to talk about two key findings based on research that my colleagues and I have been conducting at the Center for Peace and Justice at Breck University and at the University of Oslo in Norway. And on the basis of these two key findings, I'm going to talk about two alternative approaches or two interconnected solutions. It's undoubtedly going to be hard to make these alternative approaches a reality. But the fact is that it's an uphill battle, and just because it's an uphill battle, that shouldn't be a reason to shy away from trying to alleviate the plight of the Rohingya people in Bangladesh. The first key finding is that with a limited right to have rights, the status of over 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh is precarious. And the second key finding is that very limited employment opportunities, which allow Rohingya refugees to serve as volunteers and informally access the labor market, provide some scope to earn money in amounts that are barely enough to sustain themselves. However, in the end, they're far from sufficient to make them financially empowered or self-reliant in line with the objectives of the UN Global Compact on Refugees. So I'll begin by shedding some more light on the precarious status of the Rohingya people in Bangladesh. Let us for a moment think about the existing legal and political framework in Bangladesh. As you know, Bangladesh isn't a state party to the Refugee Convention or its protocol, and it doesn't have a national refugee law. The majority of the Rohingya people do not have refugee status. And in the absence of refugee status, the protection is governed by confidentialized MOUs between the Bangladesh government and UNHCR, to which the refugee community have no access whatsoever. And this is why we borrow from Hannah Arendt and say that the Rohingya in Bangladesh live with what we call a limited right to have rights. And this enables the Bangladesh government to respond to the plight of the Rohingya in an ad hoc manner, which leaves the Rohingya people in a state of precarity, as is demonstrated in their precarious access to education, to livelihoods, to justice. For example, Rohingya refugees found outside designated camp boundaries have often been detained under the Foreigners Act of 1946. In practice, the justice system available to the Rohingya people is most of the time not through formal courts, but through administrative officials in camps, the camp CICs, which Shofir Bhai referred to, and also informal systems of justice led by Rohingya armed groups and also Rohingya community leaders. When we think about the right to education of the Rohingya people in Bangladesh, I mean, during extensive field work in Ukhia and Bhasanchar, many of the Rohingya refugees who participated in focus group discussions with us felt that the educational facilities in camps existed only in name, and many of them were merely for show. They also expressed dissatisfaction at the quality of education run by the NGOs, with one Rohingya respondent pointing to low salaries for teachers, and which resulted in a lack of qualified staff in schools that were run by NGOs and INGOs. This brings me to the second key finding, which relates to the access to livelihoods and the right to work of the Rohingya people in Bangladesh. As we know, the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh are not officially or legally allowed to work. This decision stems from fears of exacerbating tensions with host communities and concerns that employment opportunities would encourage refugees to stay rather than return to Myanmar. Yet work happens. Refugees participate extensively in the informal economy, often in very exploitative conditions. And this is something that Geoffrey Bai touched upon in his intervention. Some are engaged by NGOs or UN agencies and as volunteers, earning small stipends that ensure a very small degree of dignity to their precarious lives, but fall far short of real self-reliance. Let's not forget that decades of marginalization in Myanmar meant that the Rohingya also lack formal education or vocational training, which is needed to sort of break into skilled professions in Bangladesh and beyond. And so what we see is a cycle of dependency. Refugees are dependent on that humanitarian aid, while the host state and the communities feel the pressure of limited resources. And although they're not officially permitted to work, many Rohingya refugees engage in informal labor outside the camps or in businesses that are either refugee-run or in partnership with host community members. And refugees accessing the informal labor economy in the host community stay outside the camp for, let's say, 5 to 10 days straight. It was a shared understanding between the refugees and the Rohingya Majis and the police that the refugee men would return to their shelter in camps only after their work was complete and they had earned an amount of money. And when we spoke to the refugee community, some reflected on the interlinkages between access to livelihoods and education. When a 20-year-old Rohingya man working as a day laborer inside camps was asked if he had ever the desire to get an education, he said, "I do want to, but I also have to eat. And if I study, I can't get by. And if I focus on getting by, I can't study." So it's that loophole, right? It's that deadly cycle. And interestingly, while Rohingya refugees living on Bhashanchar, at least formally or technically allowed to work, the lack of market integration with the mainland has severely limited the ability to develop sustainable livelihood opportunities on the island. And this problem left many Rohingya refugees disappointed and betrayed after agreeing to shift to the island, only to find a severe lack of work opportunities. Now, this brings me towards potential solutions. As I said at the beginning, I have two in mind. First of all, Bangladesh should adopt a national refugee law. And such a law, it doesn't need to exactly replicate the 1951 Refugee Convention. Instead, it should be rooted in the lived experiences of the Rohingya in Bangladesh and rooted in Bangladesh's own long history of hosting displaced populations with limited resources. And over the past 2 years, I was fortunate to sort of lead a team of young, passionate researchers, and we ended drafting a comprehensive, I feel that it's quite comprehensive, draft of a model law for refugees in Bangladesh that emphasizes on key issues relating to access to livelihoods, education, justice, and the right to movement, among other key rights. And this brings me to the second potential solution or recommendation. The right to work really needs to be addressed, and we need to go above and beyond the law. And this is where I feel that the international community has a vital role to play. Bangladesh, for instance, we could take a look at the compacts relating to Jordan and Ethiopia, which provide important precedents, where, let's say Jordan issued work permits to Syrian refugees in exchange for foreign investment and trading preferences. A similar compact in Bangladesh, which is backed by international financing, could allow Rohingya refugees to contribute meaningfully to Bangladesh's economy rather than be wrongfully perceived as a burden. And we don't really even have to call it the Bangladesh Compact. I was on a call with Martin and Dr. Crisp and Florence last month, and it was pointed out to me that the label Bangladesh Compact, it can attract negative attention due to the limitation of previous compacts. And I absolutely acknowledge that. We can call it whatever we want, really. But at the end of the day, but essentially the point I'm trying to make is this: the international community in Bangladesh need to come to an arrangement that would give real meaning to what we call responsibility sharing. And we're talking about a region which is very poor. And over the past year, due to the political transition that we're going through, the situation has become challenging than before. And I always recall this conversation I had with a Rohingya refugee when I first visited Bhashanchar in 2022. And he said that, we're really sad here, but the easiest way to sort of address my sadness is to let me work. I want to work. If you let me work, all my sadness is going to go away. So when it comes to sort of searching for alternative approaches to the Rohingya, particularly in Bangladesh, because that's where I work and that's the kind of research that I've been doing, there is still scope to move away from precarity towards meaningful protection. There is still scope to move away from exclusion to empowerment. And to achieve protection and empowerment, we really need to sort of envision the value of enacting a domestic law for refugees in Bangladesh, which would address the architecture of exclusion that Shofi Bhai was talking about during his intervention. And also we need to think about forging a compact with the international community that promotes greater responsibility sharing, so that the integration of the Rohingya people into Bangladesh is perceived and really ends up as a win-win for the Rohingya people and also for the local people in Bangladesh. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you to our two speakers. I think everyone will agree these are highly insightful and thought-provoking. So are there any questions anybody would like to put? Yes, please.
Sorry, who was it? Hi, thank you for that. Can you hear me on the mic? Yeah, okay. All right. Two things. Thank you for those presentations. I've just got a comment here from someone who represents a country that's not represented here today, saying that Shafur Rahman's statement, which was very powerful, could be used almost verbatim for the country government that they're in. And that country is not represented here. So I just wanted to mention that there are other voices listening to this saying it is the same. Also, I just wanted to mention the very data-driven kind of stuff that you've brought to us today that shows us the possibility of moving forward. In terms of USAID cuts, in terms of all of this, who is doing the research? Where are we going to get the data from that is prompting us? For example, the gentleman asked, where do we get the data to say starvation is imminent and when? And I'm just wondering how many people are still funding proper research-led data into this particular community.
Just building on this point, we have several questions online on this question of accountability and data. And we had someone, I thought, built on your question nicely, who asked about the likelihood of suggesting a UN-sponsored fact-finding mission. And in general, how can member states and influential international actors contribute to ensuring accountability for the Rohingya population? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I was just both really interesting contributions, but I was wondering if we could try and distill recommendations down to if we were speaking with the British government or other national governments, what sort of action can countries in Europe take to help facilitate this? You mentioned sharing more a shared responsibility and sharing that burden, but what practical steps could be taken to do that?
Hi, thank you so much for both your presentations. So it's really interesting because it seems to be that resettlement is no longer a viable route or a durable solutions for Rohingya refugees. It seems to be like there's a tension between local integration in Bangladesh versus repatriation back to Myanmar. And I'm kind of wondering, are the solutions for IDPs in Myanmar going to be very different to the solutions that we might see for Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh already? And how can the two perhaps be integrated?
Let's take those questions. Doing it one time to answer. Shafir, would you like to respond first to the question on accessibility to data as relates to welfare conditions, famine, etc.?
I'm going to pass on that to Dr. Sanjeev Hussain because he's an academic, whereas I'm just a lowly journalist. So if you don't mind, Dr. Hussain.
So there's a website called Humanitarian Info, and I would urge you to take a look at that. There is actually a lot of data out there, and that data can be indicative of the situation in Bangladesh, the refugee situation in Bangladesh. So I would say that take a look at what is available. Yes, it's true that there are funding cuts, and that has impacted quality research. And of course, let's say, and even if we set aside funding just for a moment for the sake of argument, let's say access. It's not easy, right? To understand the situation, you need unimpeded access. So there are limitations there. It's hard to come by. So I would say that there is data out there. You just need to know where to look. Humanitarianinfo.org is definitely somewhere to look. I don't know if it directly speaks to the prospects of famine, et cetera, but you'd be surprised that basically the framework that exists, led by UNHCR, IOM, et cetera, you'd be surprised to see the extent of data that they've basically dumped. They've made accessible. You just need to find it, and it is there. Even in terms of meeting minutes, surprisingly, they're there. So that's what I have to say about that. I think there was one question which I could potentially answer if you want about,
please.
What can countries from Europe do? So I think, and I'll touch upon something. So what Shafir Bhai essentially is saying is, before you invest or before you sort of help out Bangladesh more, you need to change the architecture first, right? The architecture of how rights are received by the Rohingya or are ensured to the Rohingya people, and I agree with that view. But obviously, I wouldn't go to the extent of saying stop the money entirely, because then we're going to be in a really bad situation. We already are. But what I would say is what countries from Europe can do is, why don't you push for this law? Because then we can move away from ad hocism. We can move away from sustaining this precarious legal status. And we can say, if you push for a legal framework that judicially ensures the right to, the access to livelihoods, healthcare, education, justice, et cetera, that can be the precursor to further engagement, which would facilitate, the inclusion of Rohingya refugees into the Bangladeshi economy in a more formal way. And then there are plenty of lessons to take from the Jordan Compact. Why don't we critique that? And why don't we take the lessons from that? Right? So, yeah.
I'm really sorry, but there's a question from someone who's online right now and probably can't get through. And they're asking, sorry, there's a question online from someone who I think we can get through, and they're just asking, sorry, I just see this. Does ASEAN have a role to play? We haven't mentioned any ASEAN countries yet.
Perhaps I could chip in here.
Please do, Shafir. I was going to come to you anyway.
Yeah. I think just to add to Dr. Hussain's statement about funding, I think it's worth remembering what happened a couple of months back. Was it a couple of months? I can't remember. When the teachers, about 1,200, 1,300 teachers were sacked by UNICEF because there's no money for teaching. And these are Bangladeshi teachers. Now, when that issue erupted, I was reading that UNICEF employs better funding models and indeed inclusive education strategies in other countries like Jordan, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Sudan. So this is why it's very important that these things are discussed. There was another question about what the UN should be discussing, what the New York agenda should be. So one of the primary things is, look, I mean, I may have said that you make funding conditional, but you've got to discuss multi-year agreements that allow education programs to address medium and long-term outcomes, because the hostility and the resentment that you're getting now is because of the way the funding model has been constructed. So I think one of the main things in the New York agenda is that we've got to stop pretending that short-term aid alone can solve a long-term crisis. The agenda must focus on achievable shifts that restore rights and agency. And how do you do that without saying to the Bangladeshi government, rethink the model, you know, get rid of this reactive emergency kind of approach, develop a more rights-based approach, which might require conditional funding. Yeah, so this is what I wanted to add to that debate about funding and the UN agenda.
Could comment on the ICC question. Do you think you could ask her to
Yes, Letitia, if you're still online, perhaps there are a couple of points you could respond to. One is the ICC question, and the other, I guess, related is the point or the question that was made about a fact-finding mission or exercise to Myanmar, I guess. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, there were two questions that I saw in the coming by that I thought I might want to say something on. The first one was about the issue of militarization of the conflict in northern Rakhine State and Bangladesh. And the question was how that might be addressed. It's a tough question. First of all, you have to realize that in that border area is known for a great deal of illegal trafficking of goods and people and what have you. Crime is a real issue. And that makes it much more difficult to understand, to look at the complexity of who's who, and why are they operating in these given areas, whether it's for military purposes or for other purposes, or humanitarian purposes, getting medication and food to the other side. What is going to be interesting is to see Bangladesh is going for elections, in about 3 months' time, or just a little bit over 3.5 months, there will be elections, and we do not know what the new government might be prepared to do in order to change the situation and to take another look at what is happening there. Meanwhile, it's very important that international experts who look at the issues of militarization in certain parts of the world look much more closely and give much more detail about what they think is happening. One who's done very well, I think, is International Crisis Group has given quite detailed reports about this, but they don't seem to be getting much traction. But it is the international community, first of all, that in its discussions with both those on the Bangladesh side and on the Arakan side raises these kinds of issues, and that's not done enough. I mean, it's people are still being very politically correct, if I may say it that way. The second question related to the ICC. Well, I'm in The Hague, speaking to you from The Hague. And of course, I'm quite familiar with what is happening here, both in the ICC and ICJ. Like others, I'm really disappointed that it's taking that long, particularly in the ICC. And it's not, you know, it's now more than 9 months ago since the prosecutor of the ICC submitted a request to the judges of the ICC to issue a number of arrest warrants, including against Min Aung Hlaing and others. We have been waiting for 9 months or more for the answer of the judges, and I think it's important to also publicly put a bit more pressure on the ICC. Obviously, they have good reasons to take their time, but if you look at how quickly arrest warrants were released by the ICC against Putin and against Netanyahu, why does it take so long in a much older case like that of Min Aung Hlaing and other military leaders of the country? My hope at the moment is more on the ICJ, which is even slower, but which is winding up. The court, the written phase of the proceedings has been closed. The court has set a deadline of 25 September for other states parties to the Genocide Convention to give their comments and their suggestions. That's 3 weeks from now. More importantly is what comes after that. After that, the judges will set a date for the final act before they rule, and that is another public hearing in The Hague, much like the one where Aung San Suu Kyi was present all these many years. And I'm hoping that that final act will take place, hopefully, I would hope for the end of this year, but it's more likely to be early next year. After that, the court has all the documentation, all the parties have said what they wanted to say. So we should expect in 2026, and I hope early on in 2026, a ruling by the judges on the issue of genocide. And that will be particularly important because it'll point to the world that the concerns that so many people have been expressing over many years were justified. And I'm really hoping that it will go in the right direction also because, you know, many governments keep saying, oh, well, genocide. You need a legal ruling for that. The judges need to rule before we can do anything, which is nonsense, but I'm not going into the details now. But it is important to convince member states of the importance of what has been and what has been happening in Arakan state and has led to the charges of genocide. Thanks.
Letitia, I'm not going to let you go quite yet because there was a question related to IDPs in Rakhine State that was put. Now, given that access to Rakhine is very restricted, and as you yourself referenced, the fog of war, that might be a difficult question to answer. In the same vein, the famine question. But if you could share whatever insights or knowledge you have, that would be most appreciated. Thanks. Over to you.
If you look at the recent reports about the humanitarian situation, the number of IDPs in Rakhine State, there is quite a bit of information available. I mean, many UN organizations have looked at this, others have looked at this. The credibility of some of these reports varies, but they do open up discussion and from the right people. I was pleasantly surprised this afternoon to come into my inbox a copy of the very detailed response that the ULA, the the United League of Arakan, the civilian wing of the AA, has just issued, based on the findings of a report by the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights that was issued just a couple of weeks ago. Very detailed, willing to engage, giving their perspective in a fairly detailed manner. So, I mean, this again is my plea, I made it before, not to only look at, NAPIDO as the source of information and of guidance for the international community, but to look much closer and closer to Bangladesh at the parties that have influence at the moment over what is happening there. And one of them, obviously, is the Arakan Army and the ULA. That doesn't mean that I agree with the comments that have been given. I haven't had the chance to really study them closely, but they are willing to engage. And I think that is very different from what we have seen until now, and engage publicly and spread the information around. Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't see further questions. In that case, I use my chairman's privilege to put a question both. I'm sorry. Just a preview. The question I would like Sanjeev to address afterwards would be this. Lots of exhortations about policy and legal reform in Bangladesh. But how could foreign governments and external actors encourage such reforms to take place? It's easy to say. How do we get them or encourage them to take those initiatives?
Sort of links to the last 2 points that have been raised. From your presentations, both of you that you've given us, there's no legal mechanism for getting justice for the Rohingya people inside Bangladesh itself. And there's no, as far as I can see, any regional mechanism either for that. They don't have legal status, as far as I can see, either in Bangladesh. So what initiatives can we actually undertake? Because it doesn't really fit within the ICC and ICJ mandates to do this. What initiatives can be undertaken to give them some legal status within Bangladesh, and therefore what external justice systems can be operated or should be operated? Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, thanks. This is a broader question, which perhaps refers to all the panels. We're hearing people talk about the international community, which is essentially a shorthand now for the liberal West, or once liberal West. We've just had a hugely significant realignment of the world's authoritarian powers in China, bringing together China, Russia, India, lesser or middle order powers like Turkey, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on, and nasty little regimes like the Myanmar regime. So the power in Myanmar can just say, we're not going to listen to you guys, which is what they've been doing for decades. Why should they listen to people like us? This might sound like a counsel of despair, but when they have Russia backing them up, to a lesser degree, China, so on. So essentially, and I'm not an advocate of realpolitik, but that is what's needed. One of the big players in the region to intervene and bribe the regime to stop all this warfare within their borders, including the Rohingya issue. And the only power I could see that could possibly do this, and this is perhaps a complete fantasy, is India, which has historical links, of course, with the Myanmar common border, trade links, and so on. So I wondered if people thought that this global realignment of powers, of authoritarian powers that we've just seen, is totally negative for resolving the Rohingya issue, or there might be some weird lateral way of taking advantage of that realignment. Maybe a totally off-the-wall question.
Thank you. So first, followed by Chef.
Thank you. So how can foreign states, let's say, negotiate with the Bangladesh government or influence the Bangladesh government to enter into a situation where the Rohingya people would have judicially enforceable rights within the country, right? It's a matter of acquiring political will. That's the obvious answer, right? Let's look at it this way. From 2017 to 2025, it's an interesting reality, but Bangladesh, despite many limitations, has by and large upheld the principle of non-refoulement concerning, over 1 million refugees. Now, why did they do that? It's practically the cornerstone of the Refugee Convention. It's because there is an amount of political will which compels them to adhere to that key principle. So the point that I'm trying to make is foreign states need to, when we need to say it long enough and intensely enough that it is absolutely essential to enter into an agreement where the Rohingya refugees in the country will have a set of judicially enforceable rights. And when we do that enough, it could potentially translate into a reality. That's point number one. I wanted to address something that was said by someone. It relates to judicial mechanisms to address atrocities committed against the Rohingya people in Bangladesh. Now, of course, we know about the ICJ and the ICC, et cetera, et cetera. It is true there are no regional mechanisms. I agree with that point of view. However, in Bangladesh, we have something called the International Crimes Tribunals Act of 1973. Potentially, the wording of that act does allow scope for prosecutions to take place of particularly the crime of deportation as crimes against humanity. So at least in theory, that mechanism is there for initiatives to begin. But I would like to reiterate this is a theoretical point that I'm trying to make. I don't know if that would ever happen, and of course there are new trials going on under the tribunals, and that's controversial in itself. So the point that I'm trying to make is at least there is something there, but a lot of thought needs to go behind that to actually see whether that's a feasible sort of alternative. Finally, I just want to take 30 seconds to address a point that Letitia made. Letitia, you were talking about the uncertainty around the elections that are scheduled to take place in about 3-4 months' time. Absolutely, I agree with you. But what's interesting is let's hypothetically imagine a situation where elections are held, and to top on that, let's say the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, which was until recently the major opposition party. Let's say that they come to power. In 2023, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, led by Khaleda Zia and Tareq Rahman, they held a press conference in Dhaka where they proposed 13 proposals concerning the Rohingya refugee situation in Bangladesh. Like, what would a revised policy look like? This is available on the BNP website. I think we can hold them accountable to that. You're on record proposing 13 things, and if you look at the last 3 proposals of that list of 13 things, you'll see that they talk about the right to work of Rohingya adults, the right to education of Rohingya children, etc., etc., etc. So they're on record proposing these things. If they come to power, we can say, well, why don't you follow through?
Thank you, Shafia. He had to leave. Fine. Are there any more questions? Over to you, Letitia.
Sorry.
Apparently you wanted to make a point on ASEAN's implication in...
There was a question about ASEAN.
Does ASEAN have a voice?
And the role ASEAN might play in crisis.
Yeah. Does it have a role to play in the ASEAN crisis?
And I wanted to say something about that. ASEAN, there are certain things ASEAN can do, and there are other things ASEAN cannot do. ASEAN is an organization that is based on consensus for decision making. So you can never expect it to go very far. But it is interesting that it was the first international organization that responded to the coup and actually stopped Min Aung Hlaing from participating in their deliberations. So that has been a strong message. But when it comes to actual implementation of what they had hoped to do, they haven't gotten very far. But they're still an important organization. The problem is that, you know, if you look at ASEAN, and you know there are 10 ASEAN members, only 2 of those 10 share a border with Bangladesh, Laos, and Thailand. And this is again, you know, shows you why the situation in Myanmar is so complicated, because it's right in the middle of a number of international borders. The border between South Asia and Southeast Asia, the border between the Muslim world, the Hindu world, the Buddhist world. It is a very diverse situation. But many of the ASEAN members, I'm not saying they're not interested, but for Philippines, this is very far away. Another one that's far away is Indonesia, but it has, especially during its chairmanship of ASEAN in recent years, done quite a lot. Now, at the moment, the chair of ASEAN is Prime Minister Anwar of Malaysia, a country that has about 120,000 Rohingya refugees. He has been trying, he and the Minister of Foreign Affairs have been trying to do things behind the scenes, I think. But they have not done very much in their own country of looking at what to do with this large number of Rohingya that are in their country. And who have, even if they're registered with UNHCR, they have a very low status. So I think we shouldn't expect too much from them, although, you know, I hope that ASEAN in the coming couple of months before its chairmanship ends will actually do something and will realize, and already realized no doubt, that in New York, people will look also at Malaysia as a country that holds 120,000 Rohingya refugees. So it's again a question of international gentle pressure that needs to be brought on all of these other actors also in ASEAN, and Malaysia and Indonesia, which are the 2 with the most Rohingya refugees, to open up and to speak out openly and to be advocates for a broader solution. Thank you.
Thank you.
A lot of interest online and in the room about the role of China, and Martin Smith has expressed that he's ready to jump on the call to discuss it.
Martin,
Yes.
if you're still online and you heard all that, would you like to respond on this question about China's intervention or involvement?
Yes, I mean, I think we've got to talk about a front state strategy, the countries around Myanmar, rather than from afar. you know, China and countries like this very nervous about Myanmar becoming pro-Western and Western aid agencies moving in up to the Chinese border. So there's many other sort of aspects to this. And since the coup, you know, ASEAN by the UN was allowed, because nobody knows which, you know, there's poison chalice, who's going to take this on? So ASEAN has its 5-point principles, and then we have the 1.5 meeting, which included India and China and Thailand and so on. So there's all these different interests. And I know Indonesia got very exercised about how it was unable to use, you know, its time chairing ASEAN to bring around constructive results. So by default, and we maybe need to talk about Thailand as a model later, where Thailand has a huge refugee issue and migrant issue. And what tends to happen, and I found around all the borders, is none of the neighboring countries want to lose any life of their own service personnel while there's a civil war across the border. Whatever goes on, the security of their own country is very, very important. And whenever shells go over a border or someone gets killed, whether it's China or Thailand or Bangladesh, it really, you know, sets the intelligence agencies, the security agencies running. So that's just a background thought. On China, yeah, there is a country which really is the dominant power. And we haven't discussed it till now because it's so difficult to know what it is. But this is not just Myanmar. This is Bangladesh relations with China, Myanmar's relations with China. We're seeing what's happening in Laos. We've seen what's happening in Cambodia. All of them are rapidly coming under China's economic orbit. And that has been a gradual, long-term strategic plan. It's not a conspiracy because it's absolutely what China wants to do, and it tells everybody. We know through the Belt and Road. For 20 years, China's policy for solving conflict in Myanmar and Bangladesh and any other neighboring country is told in infrastructural terms as to how China developed its own economy. And it produces, in the situation of Myanmar today, and it's been going on for about 10 years, China got a big shock, 2011-12, when suddenly the Myitsone Dam, this huge hydroelectric project, was cancelled. They still call it the Myitsone shock. China suddenly realized it couldn't do everything it wanted in Myanmar economically because there might be local grievances, there might be governments there they don't want. So what we have is the Belt and Road. And that is true for Bangladesh, it's true for Myanmar. Now, Chinese officials, if you look, they always say three things they want from Myanmar. One is peace, one is economic progress, and thirdly, they always say settlement of the Rohingya crisis. Now, that's very interesting because we don't actually know what that means, but we can have no doubt at all that China would love to see an economic development in Bangladesh, which would combine with peace in Arakan, which would be an economic model where China's interest in opening up to the Bay of Bengal would come to fruition. We're talking about oil and gas pipelines, which have gone through. We're talking about a Trans-Asia Railway. We're talking about highways. And most importantly, we're talking about the Chaopu deep sea port, which is in central Rakhine State. And as everybody knows, the Arakan, the United League of Arakan actually evolved from the China border. So that's where they grew up, on the Kachin State border, and they have transferred very close to all the groups on the border into Rakhine State. So we don't know what that means. So I don't want to speculate, but just to give you an idea of how this works, China is terribly well informed. It engages with everybody. If you want to have a peace conference in Myanmar tomorrow, China can organize it because the government will come, the opposition groups will come, the NLD would come, everyone would come. China is the only country with that influence. And it's built on real knowledge, real influence, real understanding of how fragile Myanmar is. So China is very careful not to sort of jump in, especially since the coup. What has happened over the last year, and this is where it becomes significant, is that as the ethnic armies have greatly increased their territory, China has suddenly said this must not damage China's personnel or economic interests. They've actually talked to one or two of the groups or three of the groups and have said you have to withdraw or you have to stop fighting over certain urban areas because that's on our economic plans. Now, if it was any other country, I would just say, well, this is a scrap here and there. And no, this is China we're talking about, which has huge long-term plans. And it will be a plan to use infrastructural development in Myanmar and Bangladesh to try and bring economic peace to that area. So that is what China will bring to the table. What we don't know is when you start having UN discussions about the Rohingya plight, seeing that China has said they have a special interest in this, what would their policy be? And I should also throw in there, I know this is a long answer, but I could also throw in there, Japan does the same. Japan has a special interest in Rakhine State. They always bring it up. And in fact, as Mr. Sasakawa, don't they, their special envoy, has a special interest in Rakhine State and goes there. So yeah, there are other interests. And it's been very good that we've talked about the workforce of the Rohingya and what they're bringing, because this is a key issue of what's going on. And just to give you a final point on that, Thailand now, after all these years of refugee camps, seems to be on the point of finally saying, well, we've got so many people from Myanmar here, we'll just close the camps down and people can just blend into the economy. This is more trouble than it's worth. So a bit of a shaggy dog answer, but I do think we need to be very aware about the neighbouring states.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. One more question, and I think we have to close for two session.
Thank you. It's Vicky Tennant again from UNHCR, and just a couple of reflections, really, rather than a question. And I think, you know, the sort of the takeaways, and certainly from UNHCR's perspective, what would we be looking to see in that outcome document from the high-level event in September. And I think, you know, what's clear is that we need a comprehensive approach. We've talked about solutions inside Myanmar and all the context surrounding that, but just to go back to the recommendations of the Rakhine Advisory Commission, which of course Letitia was part of, which is really, you know, fundamental in terms of, you know, access to freedom of movement, pathway to citizenship, access to livelihoods and basic services. And I think continuing to think about those three things as part of those wider solutions inside Myanmar when we're looking at eventual prospects for repatriation is important. And clearly, when we engage, when we're talking about how we open up that dialogue and how you create that space for the policy dialogue with, for example, the government of Bangladesh, and situating that advocacy within that perspective of long-term solutions remains really important. So when we talk about livelihoods, when we talk about education, when we talk about freedom of movement, speaking about that in the context of creating human capital, which will eventually move us towards that eventual solution, is important in terms of how we articulate the advocacy. I just want to come in again on the importance of sustaining the humanitarian assistance. And you know, we've heard the really compelling, very practical implications of where we are in terms of the funding crisis. And this really is a kind of now or never moment to press for that shift to activities that would really support self-reliance and freedom of movement, and opening up that policy space. Just want to throw in, and this comes back to some of the comments that were being made about the Jordan Compact and other approaches, you know, and when we come back to looking at how we can incentivize those kinds of policy changes, just to recall that we have had, you know, strong engagement by some of the big international financial institutions, including the World Bank. The World Bank has been heavily involved, dispersed more than $1 billion US dollars, and also very much involved and really situating, look at supporting self-reliance of refugees in camps, situating that within wider investment.
The Sheffield romance was really enlightening and perhaps revealing, but since he's not here to answer the question, perhaps Dr. Hussain can say it. We all know that the government, no government, least of all that of Bangladesh, is moved by neighborly love to welcoming the refugees from across the border. But there is sort of a kind of contradiction there when we look at the treatment, for instance, the historical treatment by Bangladesh of its own minorities and indigenous peoples. And I'm thinking perhaps of the Hill people, such as the Chakma, for instance. And how does if they mistreat their minorities for a long, long time, then you can say why this sort of act of, I'm going to say love again. And we know now, is it really sort of a manner from across the border? But on the other hand, from what you were saying, the right to have rights, how does this tally or contradict itself in that sense between the treatment of minorities and then the welcoming of, or is it the same? Is it a continuation of the same kind of attitude? Or bonus question, sorry, who will be the next recipient of the Nobel Prize in Myanmar or Bangladesh?
Sure. You're absolutely right to say that ethnic minorities, the indigenous people of the Chittagong Hill Tracts, they've been historically marginalized. That is absolutely true. And in addition to that, the religious minorities. So as you know, Bangladesh is a Muslim majority country. If you look at the Hindu community, they've endured a lot of marginalization historically. And over the past year, things have certainly taken a very negative turn, at least with regards to minority rights. To what extent does that translate to the approach taken by the Bangladesh government with regard to the Rohingya people? Now, as I said at the beginning of my intervention, I've been studying this for about 5 years now. And I've been trying to understand why Bangladesh has continued to host, to whatever extent, good, bad, since 2017. There are several reasons why it happened the way it did. And we need to keep in mind the government that was in power in 2017. It was the Awami League led by former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. If you look at Bangladesh's historic experiences, let's say if you go back to Bangladesh's creation in 1971 during its liberation war, 10 million Bengali refugees took refuge in India. So the Bengali people know what it feels like to be a refugee. Absolutely. So because they were refugees for 9 months, 10 million Bengali refugees. So was that the reason why Bangladesh agreed to host such a large refugee population in 2017? I don't think that was the only reason. There were many reasons, but I would like to believe that that was one reason. I spoke with police officers who were guarding the borders in July 2017. And what they told me was fascinating. They were like, if we had received an order from the Bangladesh government to prevent Rohingya refugees from coming in, we wouldn't have listened. Because and I know we shouldn't use the word wave, but it was like a wave of people. The people at the borders, they just wouldn't listen. So there are many reasons why Bangladesh hosted the Rohingya people. Absolutely, there's scope for great improvement, and to a great extent, I agree with what Shofri Bhai was saying, which is why we're arguing in favor of a change in the architecture of the response, right?
So thank you so much. Apologies to the succeeding session for having gone into their time, but I'm sure you all agree that we've heard a lot of very, very stimulating interventions, and I want to thank the two speakers in particular. Thank you. Thank you. It was very helpful. I was going to help you. the next to my left. Sure. Yeah.
Okay, everybody. If we could start the final session, please. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay. Welcome to the final session of this afternoon's workshop. My name is Jeff Crisp. I'm a volunteer with United Against Inhumanity, based at the Refugee Study Centre at the University of Oxford, formerly with UNHCR and with Refugees International. And I guess it's my privilege to be the last in a succession of elderly white British men who have chaired all of the sessions of this workshop. We have fully recognised that the demographic balance wasn't entirely satisfactory. I'm also the last speaker, I think, between you and a glass of wine. So the final session will be relatively brief. I'm not going to try and provide an exhaustive summary of the very rich discussion that we've had this afternoon. And we don't have any speakers for this session either. So I'd like to try and make the session as interactive as possible and allow everybody in the room and online to contribute as much as possible. Just a few words about the outcome of this workshop. Over the next few days, we will be preparing a submission to the international conference that will take place on 30th of September. Hopefully, we'll have that document ready within the next 6 or 7 days by the end of next week, and they will transmit it to New York as a submission to the conference. That outcome document of the workshop will be based very much on the agenda that we've followed this afternoon in our workshop. And if you've not already seen it, on the discussion paper that was prepared for this workshop and which you can find online on the UAI website. So just a quick reminder of the key agenda items, the key points in our discussion paper, and the key issues that we would like to address and get final reflections on in the wrap-up session this afternoon. So firstly, the situation in Rakhine State and the prospects for return. I think we've been reminded this afternoon that in looking at solutions for refugees, we should also not forget the solutions for IDPs, internally displaced people within Rakhine State and within Myanmar more generally. And I think on the issue of return, I've not heard too many optimistic statements in terms of the prospects for immediate, safe, voluntary and dignified return. And I think if I can quote Lucky Karim, I think she said, "We're not going back tomorrow." But if you've got any reflections on the prospects for return, that will be extremely interesting. We've been looking at improving conditions for Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, but also looking at the situation of local communities in Bangladesh. Maybe that element of the discussion has been a little bit lacking. So if anybody has any points to make about the situation of local communities in refugee populated areas of Bangladesh, that will be most welcome. When we talk about Bangladesh, let's not forget the issue that Sultana raised, which was the question of the Rohingya refugees on the island of Bhasan Char. I was very pleased to hear that that relocation program has been suspended, but I think we could hear some more on the situation of the refugees that remain there. I think it's around 30,000 or so, so quite a sizable population. We've looked at, in the last session, the prospects for alternative approaches to the refugee situation, particularly in Bangladesh, but also in the broader region. I was particularly taken by Shafir's concept of the architecture of exclusion and it's a content that I'm going to relentlessly steal from him and use in my own writings in the days to come. I just wanted to add to that. I think what Shafir described was very accurate, but also has a much wider applicability, that the kind of structure of exclusion that we've seen in Bangladesh is by no means unique to Bangladesh. It's a very common model across the way that refugees are treated in the developing world. And I think we should bear that in mind. So looking beyond Bangladesh. Talking a bit beyond Bangladesh, Letitia, throughout the preparations for this workshop, Letitia has constantly reminded us that Rohingya refugees are not only to be found in Bangladesh, but also to be found in very substantial numbers in other countries of the region. So any comments on the situation of Rohingya refugees outside of Bangladesh and outside of Myanmar would be most welcome. And then finally, I think I would very much appreciate any comments or reflections that people have on the international conference itself that's due to take place on the 30th of September. Those of us who have been organizing this workshop have been a little bit puzzled about what the precise purpose and outcome of that conference will be. We know that there are hope amongst many states, particularly Bangladesh, that it will be raising additional funds and make up for the aid cuts that have taken place in recent months. But beyond that, what exactly is the purpose and what are the prospects for that international conference in achieving any resolution of the Rohingya situation? So any comments on that would be most welcome. So in a few minutes, I'm going to open the floor for comments and questions on those agenda items. Before I do that, I want to make sure that everybody who's been online, and we're very glad to have so many people joining us online, want to make sure that their voice is also heard, as they haven't had direct access to the workshop in terms of being able to speak. So I've asked Florence simply to give us a selection of some of the comments and questions that we've received during the chat, during the preceding sessions of this workshop. So Florence, if you'd like to give us a flavour of what we've been receiving, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
So we've had some very insightful interventions from two Rohingya youths who are in the camps or who've at least had this experience, and I will make sure to document those and send those over. We've had a link on a student union for Rohingya development, and they've spoken on the sort of limited resources and inadequacies, the potential threats as part of the camps, and exchanging knowledges to the ground. And they've kind of made some really sentient points about their realities. There is also a question from Gabriel Hayden that I wanted to highlight and see if Sanjeev or others would have anything to say about. Lucky, it would have been great to have Lucky's insight, but it's quite late in the US or early. So someone has said that they're worried that pressuring Bangladesh to provide citizenship and integrate the Rohingya people is a proactive step to symbolically accepting their ethnic cleansing, and that could set a dangerous precedent. Are there any comments on this from Letitia, Martin, or our speakers? Or you, Jeff?
Okay, thanks very much. So before I open the floor, let me just say that, as I said before, we will be trying to draft an outcome document over the next few days. We will take full account of all of the comments received in the chat in that process. But also, if any of you here in person want to contribute to the document, we won't be circulating it for review, but if you want to make any particular points, then feel free to use the United Against Inhumanity email address to make any intervention. So we look forward to hearing from you on that. So without further ado, let me now open the floor for final comments on any of the questions that have been raised so far, and indeed any issues that you feel have been neglected. So please, I have a gentleman here.
No,
yeah. I'll hold it.
Okay. Thank you. I think I was really glad we touched on justice and accountability. For me, my whole career has been working in conflict and post-conflict zones. So accountability is a massive aspect, but one area I think maybe we've missed is opportunities for reconciliation. Because even after justice programs have happened, there's often still deep divisions between communities and ethnicities. So are there any programs that you know of? Are there any pathways that could work to help heal the scars, considering this has been going on for many, many, many decades?
Thanks. I should just say in response to that, thinking about the discussion paper and the agenda that we prepared for this workshop, we came at the Rohingya refugee issue very much from a kind of humanitarian and development perspective. I think what I've been hearing this afternoon is that we need to give more attention to the kind of justice, reconciliation, accountability, peacekeeping, peacemaking issues, so that we'll try and make sure that's reflected in the outcome document. So thank you very much for that. Get in the front row.
I mean, unless anybody else in the room has anything before me to say, if there's anyone else in the queue.
May I just respond to your comment very, very quickly? So for me, apart from meeting the immediate needs with humanitarian aid, which we are still in immediate needs, I feel justice and accountability come alongside humanitarian aid when you're trying to make something which is sustainable and long-lasting and empowering. So I'm very, don't feel like you have to put it in the paper just because of me, but if you were to put it in the paper, I would definitely encourage you to see how those programs can empower communities, especially communities without agency.
Which is exactly the point which I was going to touch on, which is that, I mean, my organization, the Myanmar Accountability Project, is looking constantly for groups inside Myanmar to work with. And the reason we do that is because as part of grassroots federal democracy, local groups are themselves investigating international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and they are finding their own solutions. And if outsiders like us, like the ICC, like anybody else who comes in, I think it has to be done with absolute respect for what local groups are very courageously doing in terms of investigating their own leaderships on both sides, including the Arakan army, including the junta, including other groups. So, I would be all in favor of justice and accountability being part of that, as long as the point is very firmly made that there are very credible groups in Rakhine State who are doing this work, and nothing should be done by outsiders that harms those processes in any way, because they are actually helping to build the kind of reconciliation that people are trying to nurture.
Bravo.
In the room. Yeah, on the right-hand side there.
Yeah, I feel this Bangladesh consent is quite different than the any other areas, how the refugees have been treated or how their progress is being made, like Europe and Turkey and other countries. The Rakhine and this Bangladesh model is completely different. It is to be treated like a Bangladesh model. My idea is that it should be like a hybrid model. And this should be acted in a 4 task force based, like we have to work on accountability. Like we have to take the one task force, they have to work on this accountability on Myanmar. Second part is to work like humanitarian ground, humanitarian socio-economic integration. We should work on a basis like we have to include them, so their life is to be taken care of like human. And thirdly, we have to have this global solidarity, that we have to work together globally all the way possible. That task force particularly work on that sector. And fourthly, I'll say that they have to be repatriated, but this repatriation should be dignified. It should not be there again, you're repatriating to some country and they will be again suffering there. There's no use of this repatriation. Actually, this will not work as a human. So we should work on that basis, that sector particularly as well. They should be dignified away to be repatriated to that country. Thank you.
Further comments? Anybody wishes to take the floor? Yes.
So just an observation on the what was beautifully termed the architecture of exclusion, and two, I guess, related points. It's an assumption on the part of many, many other refugee hosting governments around the world that impeding the right to employment, impeding business or entrepreneurship, even training, is somehow antipathetic to the goal of repatriation. In fact, the evidence shows the opposite. If you look at many, many other return situations, it's precisely those people who have capital, who have assets, who have skills that go back first and contribute to the recovery of their local community and economy. It's an under-researched area, but it's highly important and I think highly pertinent in this context. It's also highly pertinent in the context of return to a state like Myanmar, where the government is not committed to the economic and social development of its people. Rather the opposite, it's concentrating on its own survival. So that means when return happens, people have to fall back on their own capabilities, on their own networks, and their own systems. They cannot depend on the state to deliver that. And we're a very, very, very long way at that in Rakhine. Related to that, the point on local communities. That architecture of exclusion also applies to local communities too. They're not allowed to do business in the camps in Bangladesh. Now, 1 million people has transformed the demography of Cox's Bazar. And much is typically made on the negative impact of huge refugee influxes into these situations. And rightly so. There are huge consequences and costs, particularly for poorer members of the community. But there are also opportunities. So 1 million people, an accidental market, if you will, represents many, many chances for people to contribute to the economy of that camp and to their own economy. So it works both ways. And there have been consequences for local populations in Bangladesh. They deserve greater support, but most of all, they need a policy environment that allows them also to trade, to do business, to take care of some of the better health services that are offered in the camp than they have in their own district. So when we consider policy reform in Bangladesh and encourage the government to take a more open attitude to this, we need, first of all, to place their own populations at the front of that argument too. Thanks.
As we all seem to be using Shafia's concept of architecture exclusion, I mean, just a brief and fairly obvious observation is that this is the architecture of exclusion is by certainly not confined to the developing world, and we see the architecture of exclusion very much in place in the UK, in Europe, and not least in the USA. So I think it's a concept that deserves a wider recognition, but also a universal application. In fact, Martin and I and a few other people in the room from United Against Inhumanity have been working on a campaign called Stop the Inhumanity at Europe's Borders, which very much looks at the issue of exclusion of people from Europe. So it's certainly not an issue unique to Bangladesh or to other countries in the developing world. I've got Martin here on my left. Martin's been very centrally involved in the organisation of this workshop. He'll be closing the workshop in a few minutes' time, along with our representative from the UCL Diplomacy Society. I want to give you, Martin, an opportunity to offer your comments on anything you've heard or not heard this afternoon.
And I'll say my thank yous in a moment. But I think this has been a remarkably rich discussion. And I'm just wondering how Jeff is going to turn this discussion into a 2 or 3 page outcome document that we can submit to the President of the General Assembly. But knowing Jeff's facility, I'm confident that it's going to be a great piece of work. I don't know whether any of the sort of online speakers want a final word before we wrap up.
Letitia. Is it? No, Martin. Sorry, Martin.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's been really a great learning experience. You know, there is just so much complexity in it. And as I hinted, I think if we put a magnifying glass on Karen State, Kachin State, Shan State, we would come up with these terrible, complex realities. But actually, the way we're talking about it, there is a common theme. And I sort of felt, as the day went on, I began to understand more what this conference might mean. And I think we've got 2 elements here. We've really got the long-term need for solutions, reconciliation, how do we work at that? And then, of course, I perhaps underestimate it because the Rohingya crisis has always been grave. Maybe we're getting to a point where the gravity is so grave, we're talking about starvation and things like that. So in a way, we shouldn't let one get in the way of the other. We need to do both things. We need to be able to concentrate on both. And I was just thinking of something Chris was talking about, and it's sort of come up. I know there's a lot of UN people here, so when we start talking about aid and UN and aid agencies, we can all start sort of throwing out generalized critiques. But I do want to make this point that in Myanmar, a lot of the people in the country are very disappointed with the UN because it works with the government. And when the government is your oppressor, it doesn't matter how well you work. I mean, I know the UN people on the ground really do their best, but when bombs are being dropped and when aid is being corralled and when, you know, even in the last week, we've heard that, you know, NGOs are having ART medicines taken away from them by the regime because they don't want it to go to areas where the government doesn't control. It's very difficult for people to have confidence. And I think that this meeting has a chance to sort of bring that out a little bit more. And one of the astonishing things, you might have noticed how determined the opposition is. And they talk about ground up democracy and change from the ground, how they're building up their own systems. A lot of these young people who are doing this, and that includes the ULA, they are people who are deeply disillusioned with what international engagement has meant over the last decade. After 2011, the international community came in, everybody thought, well, this is going to be great. 10 years later, the situation is worse. We've had peace and reconciliation, we've had electoral reform, we've had all sorts of things, and the situation got worse. And one of the common critiques amongst these young people is that when international actors came in, they did it all top down. They didn't understand the problems from the ground. The local NGOs I know very well in the country said we were disempowered by international aid. And they were brave people standing up for civil society, trying to bring political change in the country. And it's a lot of those people who've joined the CDM who are now in the opposition. So what I'm saying is we've got these 2 elements, humanitarian aid and the politics. And I also think you've got a very vital test case to show how difficult it is for the UN to engage. And it's those subtleties, I think, will be the answers, how you can actually get involved. I don't think the UN on its own can do this.
Right, thank you very much, Martin. Letitia, any final words from you? She's still online.
There's also a last question for you.
Sorry, you didn't miss it. Okay, we'll come back to Letitia in a moment, possibly. We have final. Yeah, I can see a hand. I can't see who it is.
No.
Thank you. I just wanted to say one very brief final thing, which is we haven't actually mentioned the word localization during this workshop. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe someone else has mentioned it, but I think having a renewed focus on that, especially in the context of the UN reset, especially as funding cuts, it's local partners who are going to be hit first, not necessarily UN agencies operating in Myanmar. And also understanding that solutions for refugees and IDPs, we're not going to get towards a classic kind of durable solution anytime soon, I think, but understanding things as interim solutions and encouraging the international community to prioritize certain elements depending on what the local population might face.
Hello.
Yeah. You have the floor.
I hear absolutely nothing. I don't know what the question or the comment was. I have no idea.
I just asked you whether you had any final reflections.
Any final reflections? No, final reflections. I mean, I think we have to be much more serious about looking particularly at the international scene, about doing whatever it is that's being done in terms of advocacy, not to let it be about the Rohingya alone, but very systematically in everything that all of you do, and I know I really appreciate how much hard work is being done, to make sure that you talk about the bigger issue of reconciliation, of transitional justice, of return, and of how to return. Because I'm very worried that the conference in New York is going to be primarily a fundraising event. And if that is where it's going, I would be very disappointed, because it should be used to encourage much wider and much more forward-looking measures and advocacy than just about getting more money. Without the money, of course, obviously, nothing can be done. That needs to be there as well, but it's not the only thing. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think, Salem, you wanted to take the floor? Salem has been a very active member of our campaign.
Thank you. I've asked the second question earlier, which Dr. Hussain said he forgot to answer. And he probably sounded facetious at the time. He said, which is the next Nobel Prize recipient in Myanmar. We all know what that refers to, and I think many people hide their heads in the sand, and it's a bit of a shame. And when we look at Donald Trump selling himself shamelessly or buying people voices to nominate him for the Nobel Prize, I think it's not just the UN. What is the UN doing? It's the entire international community, for lack of a better word. But rewarding, we're so happy when we look at a large conflict like that of Myanmar and anywhere else, and then suddenly when we obtain a little result and it stops, then we reward people for nothing. Everybody knows Batman Hambegin and Yasser Arafat. But it's like if Netanyahu decided to stop his bombings of Gaza, we reward him with the Nobel Prize. And I think it would be for all of us now to look at the process and not just jump in and take little individuals who actually probably made us forget about what they had done before, just for a little 1 second of sparkling thing that they have done. It's just the reflection that I want to take, because it's very sad. I mean, we all know about Aung San Suu Kyi, but there are many people in the same situation. And I think we should reflect on that. Somber, but reflect. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Salem. One final chance for anybody who wants to make an intervention. I don't see anybody. In which case, I'm going to give the microphone to Martin Barber and then to the UCL Diplomacy Society.
Is she next to you?
Yes. Almost. Yeah.
First of all, thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks to everybody. But I would like to give Carter, Mr. Hazi, who's the president of the Diplomacy Society of University College London, the chance to say something about how they propose to follow this up from their side.
Yes, my name is Fatma Hadi, and I'm a final year politics and international relations student at UCL. I'm also the president of the UCL Diplomacy Society. Just to say a bit about our society, we're the largest student-led international relations society at UCL. We have over 300 members, and their main goal is to educate non-affiliated society with politics. So this gives us a chance to have a wider range of opinions. And because we also want to contribute to this initiative, but within our own capacity, this is why we're organizing a follow-up session in February over the outcome of the conference, where we will discuss what happened after the conference, what impact it had on the issue, which is what we're planning to do in February.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Carter. And I want to express thanks to several groups of people. And I think we should start with our fantastic hosts, Ian Martin, Jane Kinnemont, Mace Hussein, and the whole team here at UNA UK. Secondly, I want to express particular thanks to Catherine Poygers and her team at the London UNA Trust, who made a grant that has allowed us to be here. Without that, I don't think any of us would be here today. So warm appreciation, Catherine and her team at the London UNA. Thirdly, I'm really delighted that the Diplomacy Society is going to take this on, and very much look forward to the process leading up to their event in February. And I hope you will allow us to share with them the list of people who've been involved in this workshop, so that they can take advantage and contact you about what they are planning. Now I want to turn to the people who've given us so much of their deep knowledge of the situation in Myanmar and Bangladesh. I mean our speakers, our panelists, and our chairs. And I just marvel at the quality of the discussions that we've had today. A big round of applause to all of them. Finally, just perhaps to thank my colleagues in UAI, one person who hasn't, I think, spoken, but I don't know if he's with us online, who has really been the expertise behind the origins of our Myanmar task team, and that's Charles Petrie. Has he been with us? Do we know? I don't know whether he...
I think he's not with us at the moment. He may have been, I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, anyway, many of you will know him, and if you don't know him or know of him, please look him up, because he's a real expert on the situation in Myanmar and has been involved in a lot of important activities. And he's helped us to recruit people like Letitia and others. And this has really been the origins of our Myanmar task team. But this actual event wouldn't have taken place at all without the very hard work over quite a period of time of Florence, the convener of this task team, of Jill Grunwald, who has been managing the event from UAI's side, from our communications officer, Rick, who may be listening to us from northern Spain, I hope. And I just want to say thank you very much to all of them. A big applause to them. And finally, and I hope I haven't forgotten, if I have forgotten somebody that I should have thanked, then my excuse is that because I'm blind, I can't read any notes. So I may have left out something that I had in my notes.
You left yourself out.
No. Hold on. No. What I want to say as a last comment is that I think we should move forward with hope and with determination. I think we all need to commit ourselves to reminding our political leaders that leaving people in a state of inhumanity without respect for their dignity, their opportunities, their access to livelihoods is a disgrace and not something that any country should accept from its political leaders. We have to stand up against the rising tide of inhumanity around the world. And if you agree that this is a good idea, then please, if you're not already on our mailing lists, if you're not already contributing through our donate button and supporting our activities in all the different ways which you can support our activities, please do consider doing that. And we'd really welcome your support. But in the end, today has been about the future prospects of young Rohingya. And I think we should all, over our forthcoming drink, for those of us who are in the room, and wherever you are online, I just hope you'll have in mind the future prospects of Rohingya children, wherever they are in the world. And let's think, where will those children be in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? What will be their state of health? Sultana, if you could keep us informed about the development of the Rohingya children's state of health in Bangladesh, that would be terrific. But we can't allow them simply to fester and to suffocate in the kinds of circumstances in which so many Rohingya children are being brought up now. So let's look forward with hope and determination.